Good morning. My name is David Bobb. I serve as director of the Alan P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. Hillsdale College has been in Washington, D.C. doing this program, this lecture series, since December of 2008. And we're delighted this morning to have joining us from the University of Nevada, Reno, John Marini. Professor Marini is no stranger to Washington, and in a minute, one of our WIP students, a student who's part of the Washington Hillsdale internship program, will give him a proper introduction. But the topic today is very important, for we've heard recently a swirl of conversation about whether, in fact, the institution of Congress is broken. Most of it, if you follow especially what the news media has been reporting, focuses on questions of process. Is the filibuster to blame? Are there other factors at work? And the thesis that Professor Marini has been advancing, not just for months, but really for years, and indeed going back to decades, has been the same. And that is that any of the cyclical grievances that we find lodged against Congress can be explained by something called the administrative state. He's going to tell us a little bit about what all of that means later, and we'll leave lots of time, as usual, for your questions. I wanted to make just a couple of brief announcements before we do begin this morning. That is that Hillsdale has just published our first white paper. It's out online and also with a few copies on the table there. Some of you may have been present for the remarks that sparked the production of this white paper. Justice Stephen Markman has for about 17 years now taught constitutional law at Hillsdale College. He sits on Michigan's highest court, the Supreme Court, and has been looking at issues for a number of years that he believes are going to be at the forefront of our coming constitutional debate. In 1988, Justice Markman, then with the Reagan administration and the Justice Department, wrote a report for Attorney General Ed Meese. Incidentally, Attorney General Meese will be giving Hillsdale's 158th commencement address tomorrow about 2 p.m. So it's something that growing out of that then was a report done sort of on the opposite side of the legal academy. And this was a report that was issued in book form, and it's called The Constitution in 2020. Justice Markman responds to those legal scholars by saying that their vision for the Constitution would really mean that judges, not people through their elected representatives, will rule. So you can find more information about that online at our website. Justice Markman is also the featured imprimis. We're happy that from campus, the editor of imprimis and the vice president for external affairs, Doug Jeffrey, can join us today. The rest of campus is busily preparing, turning in those grades and readying for the big day tomorrow. So that means also that our WIP students are heading out. Washington Hillsdale internship program has been around for about 35 years. If any of you work at places where you'd like to have interns, like to have Hillsdale students, please see me or Jennifer Powell. We'd love to place interns. We'll have probably about 30 students here this summer, and with the opening of the Hillsdale building just across the street from here in the fall, hope that during the academic term we'll also be able to have a robust number of students. Jason Statler is a rising senior. He, this semester, a major in political science, has been able to see the fine art of lobbying while working at the American Trucking Association. So taken with Washington, but we hope not given to bouts of Potomac fever. He will stay on this summer and work at a place called the American Highway Users Association. So Jason's going to introduce our speaker this morning.
Good morning. John Marini is professor of political science at the University of Nevada, Reno, where he has been on the faculty since 1988. A senior fellow at the Claremont Institute and a member of the Nevada Advisory Committee of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, Marini served from 1987 to 1988 as a special assistant to Clarence Thomas, who was then chairman of the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. He received his BA from San Jose State University and his Ph.D. in government from Claremont Graduate School. Published widely, he is the author of The Politics of Budget Control, Congress, the Presidency, and the Growth of the Administrative State, and The Imperial Congress, Crisis in the Separation of Powers. Please join me in welcoming John Marini.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. I was asked to speak on the question, is Congress broken? The short answer is yes, for one very fundamental reason. Congress no longer fulfills its constitutional purpose. I think that sums it up. Thank you. But there is a longer, more detailed answer to that question. The Constitution established a limited national government, one intended to preserve the autonomy of civil society and the integrity of a federal system. Congress was meant to be the central political institution in a system of separated powers that depended upon each political branch fulfilling its constitutional role. But in the history of the 20th century was one of relentless aggrandizement and centralization of national governmental and administrative power. The presidency, and we have to say of both parties, going back to the beginning of the century, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, and even Dwight Eisenhower, who you might not think of as a centralizer, was actually president when the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare was created. They all sought to centralize power in the national government. But for much of the 20th century, Congress resisted. It remained a decentralizing force within the federal system. It served to defend the powers and autonomy of state and local governments as well as civil society. The reorganization of Congress after 1965 is pivotal to understanding the manner in which constitutional government came to be undermined by the rise and growth of the administrative state. As I said, the central institutional feature of the Constitution is separation of powers. It was, when it functioned properly, the obstacle that stood in the way of a fundamental transformation of the national government from one of limited power to one of unlimited power and scope. That transformation of the institution of the American government came about as a result of a gradual change in opinion concerning the meaning and purpose of constitutional government, which began in the Progressive era. The leaders of the progressive movement were hostile to the Constitution. They were implacable enemies of the doctrine of separation of powers. Whereas the Constitution embodied a political philosophy which required limitation on the power of government, the progressives were animated by a theory of the state, which required unlimited state power. Indeed, the progressive believed that the fundamental purpose of the modern state is the effective implementation of majority will, which is articulated by the political leadership and carried out by technically trained bureaucracy. The progressives knew that the Constitution, in defending individual rights, had not established the ground of moral legitimacy and will, not the will of majorities, minorities, or any branch of government. The ground of morality was established by nature itself, understood through reason. Constitution was meant to establish a rational structure of governance that prevented domination of will, especially irrational will. Consequently, it is government itself, when understood as a reflection on human nature, that made the separation of powers a necessity. Power is of an encroaching nature, so ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Consequently, it is necessary to balance the executive and legislative branches as institutions with specific virtues against each other. The virtue of the legislative body lay in its capacity to represent constituencies and through deliberation and lawmaking reconcile diverse interests while seeking a common good. The virtues of the executive were primarily administrative virtues, the capacity to act with energy, secrecy, and dispatch. The virtue of the judiciary rested upon the ability of the courts to cultivate good judgment, which required independence from the political branches. In Federalist number 70, Alexander Hamilton expressed the prevailing view of how it was thought the political branches ought to be understood. He wrote, "Those politicians and statesmen who have been most celebrated for the soundness of their principles and for the justness of their views have declared in favor of a single executive and a numerous legislature. They have considered energy as the most necessary qualification of the former and have regarded this as most applicable to power in a single hand, while they have with equal propriety considered the latter as best adapted to deliberation and wisdom and best calculated to conciliate the confidence of the people and to secure their privileges and interests," end of quote. The purpose of separation of powers was to allow each branch to participate in establishing the common good. In disputes between the branches, it is not the will of Congress, the President, or the courts, but the reason of the constitutional order which ought to prevail. The rejection of nature and reason as the standard for political life grew out of the acceptance among intellectuals of a philosophy of history. History itself, if we believe Hegel, was thought to be a rational process which culminated in the idea of the state. The rational or administrative state was to be the vehicle for the administration of progress. It signified the end of meaningful history and an end of meaningful politics. It ushered in a new age which would require the rule of knowledge or expertise. The leaders of progressivism who mobilized those theories as a political movement accepted the view that the state is an ethical and a rational organization. The state was thought to be the rational embodiment of the changing or progressive will of the people. Hence, the government of the state could not be perceived as a danger to the people's liberties. Rather, the state would provide the opportunity for the expansion of freedom, understood progressively. Consequently, once history has arrived at its last stage of development, the democratic form of society, the checks upon the power of government are not only unnecessary, but pernicious. The remaining tasks of government are primarily administrative and require the rule of organized intelligence. As a result, progressive intellectuals like Woodrow Wilson insisted that the real source of power in the modern state is in the administrative realm. It is necessary to establish an administrative bureaucracy in order to generate the requisite technical knowledge required to solve every human problem. If the purpose of government is to solve every problem, the power of government must be unlimited. For Wilson, the distinction between politics and administration would replace the fundamental separation of powers established by the Constitution. In the new progressive order, politics would still require the political branches to establish the will of majority through elections, but the administrative bureaucracy, armed with the expertise generated in the university, would carry out that will. In an ironic reversal of the constitutional order, the people, even their representatives, are required to give up their reason in order to allow a scientifically rational bureaucracy, scientifically trained rational bureaucracy to carry out their will. The prudential principle of separation of powers, like the Constitution itself, was thought to be an historical anachronism. In the final analysis, it is not the Constitution, but the will of the progressive majority, which has come to be regarded as the only source of legitimacy in democratic politics. Prior to the growth of the administrative state, the general interests of government could be articulated and partisan compromises could be accommodated within the political branches. This was so because the administrative functions of the national government were few, as were the organized constituencies allied to those functions. After the centralization of administration, the operation and interests of the executive and legislative branches were fundamentally transformed. The role of the parties was also diminished because bureaucratic patronage would become more important than party patronage. In addition, the role of the judiciary would also be transformed. The bureaucracy has no constitutional authority, but it was given enormous power by the political branches. In the administrative state, the courts have been required to enter the policy-making process as the final arbiters in the adjudication of cases arising in the administrative process. Some political observers could see the direction that centralization of administration was taking. In 1964, Ronald Reagan was already convinced that the continued growth of centralization of administration would lead to tyranny and the loss of freedom. In his famous speech called A Time for Choosing, given on behalf of Barry Goldwater, he noted, and I quote, "Now, it doesn't require expropriation or confiscation of private property or business to impose socialism on a people. What does it matter whether you hold the deed or the title to your business or property if the government holds the power of life and death over that business or property? Such machinery already exists. The government can find some charge to bring against any concern it chooses to prosecute. Every businessman has his own tale of harassment. Somewhere a perversion has taken place. Our natural, inalienable rights are now considered to be a dispensation of government, and freedom has never been so fragile, so close to slipping from our grasp as it is at this moment." End of Reagan's quote. In that speech, Reagan made it clear that centralized control of the economy and society by the federal government could not be done without undermining individual rights and establishing coercive and despotic control. He noted in this next quote, "The full power of centralized government. This was the very thing the founding fathers sought to minimize. They knew that governments don't control things. A government can't control the economy without controlling people. And they knew that when a government sets out to do it, that it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. They also knew, those founding fathers, that outside of its legitimate functions, government does nothing as well or as economically as the private sector of the economy." End of that quote. Now, Reagan had reason to be fearful of the future as regards administrative centralization. Nonetheless, in 1965, a year after Reagan's speech, Samuel Huntington, a famous Harvard political scientist, noted that Congress was still a decentralized institution which represented parochial and state interests. It could not function well within the context of the burgeoning administrative state. Consequently, Huntington pointed out, the presidency had become the dominant force in American national politics. And he observed, and I'm quoting, "Today's aggressive spirit is clearly the executive branch." Now, this is 1965. "The loss of power," he suggested, and I quote again, "can be measured by the extent to which congressional assertion coincides with congressional obstruction. This paradox has been at the root of the problem of Congress since the early days of the New Deal. Vis-a-vis the executive, Congress is an autonomous legislative body. But apparently, Congress can defend its autonomy only by refusing to legislate, and it can legislate only by surrendering its autonomy. Congress can assert its powers or it can pass laws, but it cannot do both." End quote, Huntington. But there was another option. Congress could adapt itself to the requirements of an administrative state. It could give up the power to legislate to administrative and regulatory bodies, and it could retain its autonomy by becoming an oversight body. In short, that's what happened, and it became the keystone of the Washington establishment. It may seem surprising, but until the middle of the 60s, the American regime was centrally governed, and it was still administratively decentralized. The presidency and even the parties had been centralizing forces in American politics throughout much of the century. But Congress still concerned itself primarily with the broad and general interests of the nation, and it functioned still as a deliberative and representative lawmaking body. Private or specialized interests were brokered in the economic marketplace or administered at the state and local level of government. Even as late as 1964, there was not much of a lobbying effort in the national capital of Washington by most major organizations, economic, social, religious. It's inconceivable now that any organization does not have a presence in Washington, as a lobbying presence. Now, in the period between 65 and 75, Congress created a bureaucracy capable of centrally administering nearly all of the details of American life. It attempted to solve not only the political problems of the nation, but the social and economic problems of all Americans as well. At that time, many in Congress objected to the fact that the political function of Congress as a body was changed by its increased preoccupation with the administrative process. Representative Gillis Long expressed the typical complaint, and I quote from him, "We, Congress, were turning ours from an institution that was supposed to be a broad policy-making institution with respect to the problems of the country and its relationship to the world into merely a city council that overlooks the running of the store every day," end quote. Objections such as those expressed by Long were ineffectual and short-lived. After a few years of experience, members of Congress came to prefer administration and regulation to deliberation and legislation. Representative Jamie Whitten summed up the view of many in Congress at that time in an unusually clear way. He said, and I quote, "The smartest thing we ever did was to throw the weight of the federal government behind local problems," end quote. How did Congress transform itself to accommodate this new condition, one which reflected the reality of administrative supremacy? In order to compete effectively with the president, Congress had to gain control and subsequently expand the powers of the bureaucracy. In order to do so, Congress had to reorganize itself. It did so in a wave of reforms in the early and middle 70s. At first, the reforms served to decrease the power of the leadership, primarily that of the committee chairs. It increased the power of individual members by placing subcommittee jurisdiction assignments, chairmanships, and a minimum number of staff positions outside the control of full committee chairs. In addition, the staff of Congress itself would become a major professionalized bureaucracy. The result was that the institution gave up the capacity to function as a deliberative and lawmaking body. But individual members of Congress were able to utilize professional staff to serve personal and constituency goals, even if the interests of the party, institution, and the nation itself were sometimes in conflict with those individual interests. The reforms of Congress were defended on the grounds that the institution was becoming more open and democratic, but the dispersal of power to individual members did not result in greater capacity to attain national or even institutional goals. It became much more difficult for the leadership of the parties to persuade members to act in a party or national interest. As one observer put it at the time, the autocracy of the chair broken, Congress was transformed from an institution in which power was closely held by a few to an institution in which almost everyone had just enough strength to toss a monkey wrench. In 1964, there were 47 meaningful chairmanships available in the House and Senate. By 1984, there were 326. Allowing for those who hold more than one chairmanship, 202 of Congress's 235 members, 38%, were in charge of something at that time. That something really involved the ability of the legislators to intervene in policy areas controlled by the rulemaking bureaucracy. By 75, the characteristic activity of the federal government and the legislature had become the regulation or the administration of the details of the social, political, and economic life of the nation. Such a development could not but strengthen the organized interests and their ties to the legislature at the expense of unified control of the details of administration by the executive. Even the most sympathetic observer of congressional power did not fail to notice the change. James Sundquist wrote at that time, "As members become managers of professional staffs, the chambers disintegrate as deliberative bodies in the traditional sense of legislators engaged in direct interchange of views leading to a group decision. With each passing year, the House and Senate appear less as collective institutions and more as collections of institutions, individual staff individual member staff groups organized as offices and subcommittees. It is important to understand the political significance of the transformation of the legislature. It allowed individual members the ability to enhance personal power by indirect control or oversight of the federal bureaucracy. Consequently, the attention to specific needs of interested constituents decided at the center in Washington would become the primary concern of the legislative branch. It's no wonder that the characteristic activity of government was no longer general legislation made by the representatives of the people. Rather, administrative rules formulated by technical experts were necessary for the regulation of the smallest details of life and society. Perhaps the most striking change in American politics, one still not well understood, I think, is the change that has occurred in the characteristic activity of the two political branches of government. In its constitutional origin, the executive branch was to be characterized by its capacity to act energetically in the execution and administration of the laws. On the other hand, the responsibilities given to the legislative body were primarily deliberative, with the view that compromise could result in consensus when passing legislation. The powers of Congress, which included the power to tax and spend as well as oversight of the executive, but the legislative powers were thought to be fundamentally different from those of execution or administration. The laws were thought to specify the general conditions under which departments and agencies ought to operate. Congress would function as a body, and its laws would be general and operate equally on the whole of society, including those who make the laws. Now, you might object that the Congress still makes laws, for example, the recent health reform bill. But I think you will see that that is not a law in the constitutional sense. It only makes sense within the context of an administrative state. Indeed, it was passed as a reconciliation measure, a procedure which grew out of the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. That act was intended to make Congress a major player in the administrative process by gaining control over the details and aggregates of the executive budget by a single vote on spending. As you know, the health reform bill was almost 2,500 pages long, but it was not a law. It provided the legal requirements necessary to enable the administrative apparatus, the ability to formulate the rules which govern health care. The law of 2,500 pages will turn into rules of thousands and thousands of pages. It is a work in progress, in other words. Charles Kessler, who's the editor of the Claremont Review of Books, I think caught the spirit of what Congress was doing in his recent editorial. So I'll just quote from his editorial. He says, "When our founders thought about the law, they often thought along the lines of John Locke, who described law as a community's settled standing rules, indifferent and the same to all parties, emphasizing that to be legitimate, a statute must be received and allowed by common consent to be the rightful standard of right and wrong and the common measure to decide all controversies." That's a quote from Locke, between citizens. This phone-sized law, and this is Charles, would control a sixth of the U.S. economy. This phone-sized law that would control a sixth of the U.S. economy cannot be a law by that definition. If you rummage through the text of, say, the House of Representatives version of the bill, you will find scores of places where power is delegated to administrative agencies and special boards, which are charged to fill the gaps in the written legislation by promulgating thousands, if not tens of thousands, of new pages of regulations that will then be applied to individual cases. Voters sometimes complain that legislators don't read the laws they enact. Why should they in this case? This is still Charles. You could read this Leviathan until your eyeballs popped out and still not find any settled standing rules or a meaning that is indifferent and the same to all parties. In fact, it's the point. That's the point of such promiscuous laws. They operate not by setting up fences to protect each man's liberty. They start not from equal rights, but from equal and often unequal privileges the favors or benefits that government may bestow on or withhold from its clients. The whole point is to empower governmental officials, usually unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats, to bless or curse your petition as they see fit, guided, of course, by their expertise in a law so vast, so intricate, and so capricious that it could justify 100 different outcomes in the same case. Faster than one might think, a government of equal laws turns into a regime of arbitrary privileges. And this is still Charles. A privilege is literally a private law. When the law ceases to be a common standard of right and wrong and a common measure to decide all controversy, then the rule of law ceases to be a republican and becomes despotic. Freedom itself ceases to be a right and becomes a gift or a fruit of a corrupt bargain, because in such degraded regimes as those who are close to and connected with the ruling class have special privileges, end quote. And that's just in a certain way confirmation of what Reagan had feared in 1964. Now, this extension of governmental power, I think, is compatible with the administrative state, but it cannot be understood to be within the letter or spirit of constitutional government. Let me conclude by suggesting that the administrative state grew dramatically in the last third of the 20th century, particularly with the reorganization of Congress, and it continues to expand even today. But despite its expansion under both parties, it has not attained legitimacy within the American constitutional order. It has only provoked an ongoing debate within the parties concerning the desirability of expansion, limitation, or perhaps someday diminution of the size and scope of the federal government. It seems that modern democratic societies have all attempted to centralize power in administrative states. But they are faced with the apparent paradox of being less able to govern effectively the more they try to administer the political, social, and economic details of life and society. That's the real end. Thank you. Yeah.
Stuart Reuter. On Wednesday morning, Senator DeMint was giving a talk, and he said that what has happened in Congress is that the main priority of each legislature is how much he can bring back to his constituency and his state and his area via earmarks.
Yeah.
And that the inability to swear off earmarks was one of the real problems. I think that dovetails in a more specific way with what you've been saying, and I'd like to hear your comment.
Yeah, I think there's no question that that's the thought to be what the legislator's role is. Once you centralize power in Washington, the states really as sovereign entities don't exist as sovereign entities. The states themselves are lobbyists to Washington. I mean, you have the National Association of Governors, the National Association of Mayors, the National Association of State Legislatures. I mean, the whole point is once you centralize, there's no autonomous power within the state. And so the congressman's role and even the Senate's role, the senator's role, is how to get the assets from the center back to the periphery. I mean, that's really what they think their role is. And so the only reason to go back to the state is of course to keep the state informed and to inform them of what it is you bring them.
And to get reelected.
And of course but that helps them get reelected. And when you look at that period after the institutionalization of the administrative state, and once the role of the congressman changed from one of lawmaking, it avoided the necessity on the part of the congressman to have to make controversial decisions which expose them to electoral defeat. And the incumbency then, from the periods, the 70s, all the way up to our time, incumbency is not as reliable as an indicator as it used to be. But when you think of the powers of each incumbent congressman in terms of the assets they have, and in terms of much of the bureaucracy is created to service the needs of constituencies that have been created by the bureaucracy that Congress created itself. So Congress gets credit for helping their constituents with the bureaucracy, but they don't get the blame for having created the bureaucracy. So it's a matter of, when you think about the legislative branch, when you think of a legislature like the United States legislature, since at least the mid-60s, it really doesn't function as a body. It functions almost, I mean, my Senator Reid from Nevada, his staff, his staff is larger than the staff of the presidency, probably up till the Roosevelt presidency, before the creation of the executive office of the presidency. Presidents didn't have staffs of that size. Now, any senator, or particularly a senator from a large state, is going to have large staffs, and they have offices in their districts that they staff. I mean, when you think of it really is a body of many executives over certain policy arenas. And so it's very difficult to get agreement on bigger questions. And this opens up the possibility, I think, this health reform bill, because it does, in a sense, nationalize the election, regardless of the intention of that. And one thing that changed in this bill, that when you look back at the various other reforms that were significant, whether during even the New Deal, Social Security, or the Great Society, there was not such clear, stark division between the parties. Usually, there was bipartisan support for those measures. And this time, you get really stark clarity about this bill that opens up the possibility, of course, if the Republicans are clever in how they use it, of mobilizing that sentiment and nationalizing an election and perhaps obscuring the advantage that incumbents have in the electoral process. Because when you think about the advantages they've given to themselves, and campaign finance reform too, by the way, I mean, every political science study shows that what campaign finance reform does is limit the possibility of challengers. And so it becomes very difficult to defeat incumbents. And both parties have participated in this. You must not think that this was just simply a democratic operation. And in fact, whenever a president who was opposed to the centralization of administration ran into opposition from his own party, if he was a Republican, whether it was Reagan, and even Nixon before, if you take Nixon's second term as an example, where Nixon really was starting out in a very different way as opposed to what he was planning to do after '72. But I think there's no question that decentralizing element that Congress still maintained, where their ties to their states and their concerns for protecting their autonomy of the state doesn't exist anymore. And I'm not so sure that state legislatures and governors want it. They just want money. I don't know that they want autonomy. It's not clear they want sovereignty.
There was a populist movement that led to the 17th Amendment.
Yep.
Can you discuss that and how they convinced the senators to sign off on their own reestablishment as agents of the people instead of agents of the states?
Yeah, well, that's part of all of those progressive reforms. As I said at the beginning of my paper, that for the progressives, you wanted unimpeded majority will. And the will of the people has to be established in the legislative branch. not not the possibility that the senators represent states, because the states, when state legislators, state legislatures actually picked senators, they did so, of course, with the view that the Senate, the men that they chose, would be best representative of the state interests as well. And so that was a decentralizing effect. It kept the states active. And by the way, that's one provision of the Constitution, you know, that is unamendable. That you can't deprive a state of its representation in the Senate without its consent. So the founders thought that to be fundamentally important, keeping the sovereignty of those states, because they wanted power, they wanted administration to be decentralized. They did not want every decision about the country to be made at in one place. But in a sense, that's really what happened with the centralization of administration, is every important decision on any question is made in Washington. And so everybody becomes a petitioner. Every local and state government, every kind of national association, and even if you're not, I noticed at my hotel across the street was the National Association of Realtors. I mean, even if you're any kind of activity requires a specialized effort at lobbying that requires a national presence. And this is true now, not only of economic interest, of social interest. My university itself has a lobbyist here. Every university, even religions, petition and lobby Washington. Now, if that's not a centralized administrative state, it's very close. And we're not as far along as some states, by the way. I mean, the Constitution still does function in some ways, and it does become possible periodically for leadership to arise, as Ronald Reagan said in 1980, mobilize a constituency around the sentiment that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. I mean, now, you can always do that, and that's what the separation of powers was meant to do, is to create and mobilize different constituencies. The president's constituencies are different than the constituencies that are created in the states and in the localities. So I think it is always possible, but it requires leadership. And I think what is lacking in both parties is leaders who understand what this problem is. Because once you're a part of the Washington establishment, you're blind to the problem. It's very difficult to see it when you're here, because it operates in a certain way, and people get used to it operating in that way. And of course, let's face it, many of you may work as staffers in Congress. You got your degrees at these universities. By the way, these universities themselves were created to provide the knowledge for the administrative state in the thought of Hegel. In Hegel's thought, the rational and organized intelligence that is going to be the bureaucracy, it has to be trained. And so the real keystone of the administrative state is the university and the social sciences that generate the kind of knowledge that becomes definitive in terms of how to understand these questions. All the social sciences are created at the end of the 19th century and become part of the way in which we think about this problem. And so this is the difficulty. Yeah.
Sure. So we're probably, as a result of political forces at loose in the country now, to elect a significant number of new members of Congress and state legislators who are concerned about the growth of government. And so my question is, what actually could they do? And I have two thoughts I'd be interested in your reaction to.
Yeah.
One is, would it make things better or worse to require that Congress vote to approve all of these regulations that come out from the agencies? And number two, what do you think of Ed Meese's idea that states ought to have the same power as Congress to propose individual amendments to the Constitution without having to get the approval of Congress?
Well, I think I'm not so sure that would, I don't know what it would do. I don't know what his intention would be in having that. I don't think any of these are procedural. I don't think there's any institutional way of reforming the institutions that would significantly help. I think what you need is a reconsideration of the way we think about these problems. And that requires a kind of education that goes against everything that we have, that we're taught in our schools. I mean, the real question is, it's not so clear that people do want to be free. It may be that they just want security, in which case this Constitution is not meant simply for a people that don't want to be free. I mean, when you go back, when Madison says in Federalist 57, when asked about what's going to happen if Congress passes laws and exempts himself from it, Madison basically says, well, if the manly spirit, as he calls it, of America, does not make them rise up against a body that does that to them, then there's nothing you can do for them. They're willing to tolerate. They're willing to tolerate a kind of servitude. And just think of what the administrative state has done to buy off the various constituencies. And by the way, this healthcare bill, I think, points to a possibility that has not existed before. Because when you look at the healthcare bill as opposed to the way in which the administrative state has slowly kind of built itself by extending privileges and extending subsidies to various groups, the costs of that were so diffuse that the general public really was willing to bear the cost. The beneficiaries, of course, were concentrated, and the beneficiaries were for it. So all of the beneficiaries of the administrative state are happy with the subsidies they get, and the general public is so oblivious, really, to what it costs in terms of giving those subsidies, that there's no sense in which the general public is aware of the fact that there are costs to the administrative state. But this health bill, I think, creates this possibility. For the first time, it seems to me that in trying to extend subsidies to a small group, maybe 15 or 20% uninsured, they're actually perhaps diminishing the choices of a large group, people that already have insurance. And those people, once they come to see that their choices are actually being restricted, see, people don't mind getting benefits from the state, but they may mind when they don't have the choices that they have. So it's possible, I think, to mobilize that sentiment that this majority of people that are happy with their health care can be mobilized on behalf of an opposition, really, to that extension. When you give particular kinds of benefits that are not noticeable, the people accept, and this process has been slow in terms of the 20th and 21st century of extending benefits and privileges and various other things. But the great number of people have not seen that there is a cost for this. So this time, I think they're going to see perhaps, and this is why I think they structured this bill the way they did, so as to minimize the effect of this for a while. But as I said, I don't know how you can deal in a structural way with the loss of vigilance that a people have to have in order to retain control over their government. I think, I think people now don't even think that their rights are derived from anything but government. And so, this whole philosophy that I talked about in the beginning, the philosophy of nature and natural right that provided the ground of this view of freedom, that is receded so far into the past, and it's not even a memory for most people. Most people are, however you put it, progressives. Progressives in the sense that they believe in a philosophy of history and not nature. There's no unit this is the education you get. This is the authority of science seems to rest on, seems to confirm this philosophy of history. And all of these things now make this problem much more difficult. But I think before it can be solved, it has to be made intelligible. I don't even think it's intelligible to Americans in terms of a perspective, in terms of a conceptual framework. If you don't understand what we have become as a result of this transformation, then it's very difficult to change it. I would say, as a simple shorthand way of trying to distill the two philosophic conceptions of modern politics, beginning with the American founders who really accepted the doctrine of natural right, the doctrines of the philosophic tradition, really going back to the Greeks, but certainly the political philosophy articulated clearly by Locke, and that is that the doctrine of natural right really culminates in constitutionalism because it's based on nature. It's based on an understanding of human nature as unchanging. Now, that doctrine was being attacked just about the time of the American founding by European thinkers, beginning with Rousseau, but more importantly, subsequently, Kant, Hegel. And those thinkers, of course, established a philosophy of history which denied that humans have a nature. And they denied that reason was a distinctive characteristic of that nature. And they argued that passion or will is the driving force of history, and that the culmination of this historical process, Hegel calls it the matter of history, is in the state itself, the vehicle of the state. And so one could say that the political movement of philosophy of history culminates in the idea of the state. And the political movement that accepts the idea of the state is called progressivism. So there's a fundamental shift in the 19th century after the Civil War. And the intellectuals in America really reject, and this is true of both liberals and conservatives, whether it's William Graham Sumner or the socialists on the other hand. There is great clarity that the intellectuals at the end of the 19th century rejected the doctrine of constitutionalism and the doctrine of natural right. And when you look at the establishment of the social sciences in the period from roughly 1880 on to 1910 or so, those all are predicated on the assumption that philosophy of history is how it is that we have to understand ourselves. And the social sciences, if one were to look at this in a more theoretical way, the Hegelian way, you could say that the social sciences are meant to be the applied sciences of the state. So, you know, the American founders, when they talked about political science, they didn't talk about science as the authority for politics. They talked about philosophy as the authority for politics. And so the people that they looked to were Montesquieu and Locke and Cicero and Aristotle. But when you look at the way in which modern political science and all the social sciences look, the authority for how we understand what becomes meaningful knowledge is science. And scientific authority is really formulated as the means to solve these problems, which is the implicit premise of the administrative state is that individual human legislators, and you and me, we can't make these decisions because we don't have the knowledge. We don't have the technical training. That every decision is going to have to be made, every important decision is going to require a certain kind of knowledge. That knowledge has to be generated, and it has to have some kind of ability to be able to utilize that knowledge. And so a thinker like Max Weber will say by the 20th century that the real power in the modern state is in administration. The politicians are just dilettantes. It's those who have the knowledge that have the power. And so this is part of the difficulty, is that most people think and are, that, you know, that these problems ought to be solved, and maybe some of them, you know, it's a matter of judgment or prudence as to what it is that should be solved and what it is that the people themselves ought to do for themselves. But you know, the constitutional system presupposes a distinction between the public and the private sphere, between government and civil society. Presupposes that in civil society, of course, there are consensual and contractual ways in which people deal with each other, without force, without the necessity of government to impose order and rules. And so that fundamental distinction between the public and private sphere, which is crucial to constitutionalism. In other words, there's a line beyond which government cannot go. I don't think you can say any longer, well, I'll draw the line here, that government can't do this. Is there any problem that you can think of that if government doesn't want it, if government wants to do it, that it won't do it? Any problem. Come up with anything that you can think of. Somebody in Congress will come along and say, we should have a law to deal with that. You can't draw a line any longer between what is public and private. Yeah, go ahead, anyone who...
This global recession that we've had, combined with government spending around the world, seems to manifest in two different ways. In Europe, they're protesting because they want to make sure that the government ensures that they can retire at 50 years old and
Sure.
live the rest of their life in leisure. In America, it's had the exact opposite. It's a protest to government saying, stop doing what you've been doing, leave us alone, and do less. Do you think that gives some hope for changing the administrative state?
Oh, I think there is. This is the last best hope. America does have a certain spiritedness that you don't see. Those countries in Europe have been, in a certain way, dispirited throughout the whole 20th century. The two wars, I think, and whatever else happened there made it very difficult. But I think, when you think about it, over the course of the 19th and 20th century, so many of the people that came to America came because they were seeking freedom and opportunity. So insofar, yeah, I think America still is, compared to most people's, very much driven by the desire for production and work and even a certain kind of freedom. And so, yeah, I would say that America is an exception. But it's an exception in many ways when you think about it. Because when I said that the authority of history, philosophy of history, destroyed the philosophic ground of the understanding of America, the counterpart of that was also to destroy the religious ground. And yet when one looks at America, one says, you look at polls and you see Americans believe in God in numbers that in Europe they think these people are unsophisticated fools over there. You know, 90% of the people believe in God. So the religion and philosophy, that authority that precedes scientific authority, has not been fully undermined in America. And so I think, yeah, America still has the spirit to be able, with the proper leadership, to be, somebody has to tap it. A mass can never coalesce. A mass needs a catalyst. A mass needs somebody to bring it together, and it has somebody that knows what they're doing. I mean, when you think of the success of Ronald Reagan, relative success, I mean, there were a lot of impossibilities, but think about it. Reagan never was able to serve with the House in the Republican hand, but he mobilized a sentiment that in some ways delegitimized liberalism for a period of time, so much so that they quit using the name. And they went back to progressivism. They start calling themselves progressive. But that shows you, if just using speech, political speech properly, which so many of these people, the people on the left know how to do it. They can mobilize political speech. But the people, the Republicans and the leaders that should be able to mobilize political speech on behalf of freedom, it's much harder to find them. And you'll note about Reagan, too, that he was not one that came out of the tradition of the university and the elite university where that kind of training or that kind of way of thinking. I mean, his knowledge of economics, which he learned at Eureka College before Keynesian theory established itself, was sufficient. It was sufficient because it was commonsensical. It was based on an understanding of a kind of reality that's not imposed by science or social science. And so getting out of the, I think getting and mobilizing political rhetoric is going to be very helpful if we could, but we need to train people in how to think about these questions. And I don't think we find, except for a few schools like Hillsdale, there aren't that many places where you can get an education that can give you confidence in the kinds of principles and the kind of philosophic or theoretical understanding that enables you to go up against the sophistication, really, of the modern apparatus of the state, both its intellectual and its institutional form. All of the powers now and all the levers are in the hands of those who were defenders of the modern state. The state, Hegel called it the rational state. And that's really a better name, because what he really meant was that's the rule of organized intelligence. That's what the modern state should be. We call it the administrative or welfare state, but that's just from the point of view of what it does, but not from the point of view of how to think about it. Hegel's way is better in terms of how to think about it. And of course, we all benefit from certain kinds of progress in science and medicine and all of those. So progress, in a certain way, we're all for, right? Certain kinds of progress. But the question is there progress beyond these principles? Is there progress beyond the principles of human equality and liberty, understood the way the founders did? And if there is no progress, then of course there's no. If there's no progress, as Calvin Coolidge once put it in 1926 when he gave his famous speech on the Declaration, says there's no progress on the advance of that. You're only going back to despotism again.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
I wish we did have time for more questions, but Professor Marini will be able to stick around for a few minutes if you do have some more. You can see from that presentation why Justice Clarence Thomas credits both Professor Marini and Professor Marini's colleague Ken Masugi for their assistance in understanding and shaping even his judicial and political philosophy. We're grateful for Professor Marini's talk. You can find it online. We'll send that to you by email so that you can share it with your friends and colleagues. Let me close by inviting you to the next First Principles talk. That will be held on the first Friday of June, June the 4th. In the next couple of weeks, we'll see a nomination come from the President of the United States for a Supreme Court justice. To discuss that process and how we ought to understand the role of the judiciary is Ed Whalen, a person who is known to many in the legal community. He is the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, blogs regularly on bench memos, and will be speaking to a very timely and important topic. So that will be on June the 4th. You'll get an invite by email. Please do share that as well with your friends, neighbors, and colleagues. Thank you very much for coming.